After my graduation, I found my parents gave our family business to my sister. The celebration felt hollow even before the announcement landed like a heavy slab of raw oak on the dinner table. My mother looked at me with a practiced pity that usually preceded a lecture on humility. She did not hesitate when the question of leadership finally arose after the dessert plates were cleared away. Mom said, "I was just good with my hands, not my brain." As if my engineering degree were a mere hobby, rather than a structural necessity for our survival. Her words cut deeper than any chisel I had ever sharpened in the workshop. So I stopped my 60-hour unpaid weeks without a single word of protest or a formal resignation. I simply went home and waited for the silence to speak for itself. The first few days of my absence were marked by an eerie stillness in my phone logs. Then the vibration started and did not stop until my battery died from the strain of their desperation. When Dad called about our biggest client, his voice lacked its usual booming authority. He sounded like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on a foundation made of sand. The workshop at dawn always possessed a specific blue light that made the sawdust look like fallen snow. I used to arrive at 5 in the morning to calibrate the CNC machines and prep the joinery before the humidity could warp the grain. Now, I sat in my truck in the driveway of my small apartment and watched the sun climb over the neighboring warehouses. My hands felt unnaturally light without the familiar weight of a measuring tape or the vibration of a belt sander. The skin on my palms was finally beginning to heal from the seasonal cracks that defined my childhood. I spent the morning drinking coffee that actually stayed hot because I wasn't rushing to solve a logistical crisis. My father's third voicemail was shorter than the others and contained a strange, frantic edge. He mentioned the Miller Group contract, as if I didn't already know every line of their complex architectural specifications. They were the backbone of our revenue, and the only reason we weren't drowning in debt. Without my oversight, the production line for their custom cabinetry was almost certainly stalling into a chaotic mess. I deleted the message and watched a stray cat climb over the fence. Lily never learned how to read a technical drawing because she was too busy learning how to curate a brand aesthetic. She viewed the workshop as a backdrop for her social media posts, rather than a place of rigorous manufacturing. My parents nurtured this delusion by putting her face on the website, while I stayed in the back covered in grease. They believed that if something looked successful on a smartphone screen, the reality would eventually catch up. Now that I was gone, the reality was catching up with a vengeance that no filter could fix. I checked the company Instagram and saw a photo of Lily holding a mallet she was gripping completely wrong. The comments were full of praise from people who had never stepped foot on a factory floor. Beneath the digital applause, I knew the physical world was falling apart in real time. The shop floor was a living organism that required constant, intelligent adjustment to function. Lily didn't know how to adjust a blade height, let alone a multi-state shipping schedule. My mother had mistaken my quiet competence for a lack of intellectual ambition. She would soon realize that the brain of the operation was the part she had just discarded. The humidity in Texas can ruin a high-end wood project in less than 4 hours if the climate control isn't managed. I knew exactly which vents in the shop tended to stick and which dehumidifiers needed a kick to stay running. My father called again at noon, while I was walking through a public park near the river. He didn't lead with a greeting or an apology this time, but went straight to the technical failures. The Miller Group had sent an inspector to check the first batch of the mahogany panels for their new corporate headquarters. Apparently, the grain matching was a disaster because nobody had supervised the initial sorting process. My father's voice cracked when he told me that the inspector had threatened to void the entire contract on the spot. I He wanted me to come down for just 2 hours to talk the inspector through the grading standards. I listened to the wind in the trees and remembered the night. I stayed until midnight fixing his mistakes. He had told me then that my hard work was its own reward, and that I shouldn't be so greedy for credit. Now he was offering me a steak dinner if I would just save his reputation. I told him I was busy looking at the ducks. My mother's face appeared in a FaceTime request 10 minutes after I hung up on my father. I didn't answer it, because I didn't want to see the performance of maternal concern she was undoubtedly preparing. She would try to frame my departure as a selfish tantrum that was hurting the family legacy. To her, the business was a sacred entity that I was obligated to serve regardless of the compensation. She had spent years telling me that my sister had the soft skills required for the modern business world. According to her, I was a relic of a bygone era of manual labor that didn't require strategic thinking. I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet I had been building in secret for the last 6 months. It contained a list of every supplier contact, every proprietary assembly method, and every client relationship I had cultivated. I hadn't stolen anything from the company's server, because the information lived entirely in my own head. My mother believed the business was a set of machines and a brand name that Lily could manage. She didn't understand that a business is actually a web of trust and specific, hard-won knowledge. The web was beginning to snap at every corner. I spent the afternoon at a local library because the silence there felt more intentional than the silence in my apartment. I researched the legal requirements for starting a small-scale independent manufacturing firm in my county. The numbers were daunting but far from impossible if I could secure even one major anchor client for the first year. I knew the Miller Group wasn't just loyal to our family name, they were loyal to the quality of the output. The owner of the firm had my personal cell phone number and had used it several times to discuss design changes. He knew that when he called me, the problem disappeared before he even finished explaining it. My father was currently trying to replicate that relationship with a daughter who didn't know a dovetail from a miter joint. I drafted a short email to the Miller Group's lead architect, but didn't hit send quite yet. I wanted the pressure at the family shop to reach its absolute boiling point before I made my move. Timing is everything in joinery and in business, and the wood was still too green to work. I closed the laptop and felt a strange sense of calm. By 5 o'clock, the frantic energy of the day's calls had shifted into a somber, heavy rhythm. My father sent a text message that simply said, "Please, Laura," without any of the usual bluster or command. It was the first time in my adult life that he had asked for my help without framing it as a command. I decided to drive past the workshop just to see the state of the exterior yard from the road. The gates were still open, which was a clear sign that things were running behind schedule, and the crew was scrambling. I saw Lily's white SUV parked in the loading bay, where the forklift usually needed room to maneuver. It was a perfect metaphor for her involvement in the business. A polished obstacle in the way of actual production. A line of delivery trucks was backed up toward the street, because the paperwork wasn't being processed correctly. The driver of the lead truck was leaning against his cab and looking at his watch with visible frustration. I kept driving and didn't slow down as I passed the main office window, where my mother was visible. She was pacing with a phone pressed to her ear, and her face was a mask of pure stress. I went to a small diner for dinner and sat at the counter, where the light was bright and the coffee was bitter. A few of the guys from the local hardware supply store were sitting in a booth near the back. They recognized me and waved me over. Their faces full of questions they were too polite to ask directly. They mentioned that my father had been calling around, trying to find a new floor manager on short notice. Word traveled fast in this industry. And everyone knew that the engine of the Hartman shop had suddenly stopped. One of them joked that Lily had tried to order a pallet of specialty veneer without specifying the thickness or the backing. The supplier had laughed and told her to have Laura call him when she was done playing office. I forced a smile and took a sip of my coffee, feeling the heat radiate through my chest. They didn't know about the secret folder or the graduation dinner where I had been dismissed. To them, I was still the girl who could fix any machine and calculate any foreman. They saw me as a professional, while my parents only saw me as a convenient, low-cost asset. The next morning, the sun was hot, and the air was thick with the promise of a Texas thunderstorm. I woke up to a long email from the Miller Group's procurement officer that was CC'd to my personal account. It was a formal notice of default addressed to my father, citing a failure to meet the quality control benchmarks. The email was cold and professional, outlining exactly how much money the shop stood to lose if they didn't fix the issues. My father had obviously forwarded it to me, in a desperate attempt to show me the stakes of my rebellion. He didn't realize that seeing the legal language of their failure only hardened my resolve to stay away. The business was a ship that was taking on water, and he was asking the person he'd pushed overboard to swim back and plug the holes. I looked at the photos attached to the email showing the botched grain matching on the mahogany. It was embarrassing work that I would have never allowed to leave the sanding station. My parents had traded my brain for a face, and now they were finding out what the face was worth. The inspector had documented every single flaw with a high-definition camera. I finally decided to return to the shop at noon, not to work, but to collect the personal tools I had left behind. I pulled into the lot, and the smell of stressed machinery and wood dust hit me like a physical blow. The air inside the workshop was stagnant because the ventilation system had indeed failed, just as I predicted. My father was standing by the main assembly table, looking 10 years older than he had on my graduation day. Lily was in the corner, looking at a set of blueprints, as if they were written in a language she had never seen before. When they saw me walk in, a look of immense relief washed over my mother's face in the office window. She rushed out with a wide, artificial smile that didn't reach her eyes or her shaking hands. She started talking about how glad she was that I had gotten the grumpiness out of my system. She reached for my arm, as if to steer me toward the broken CNC machine that was currently smoking. I stepped back and kept my hands in my pockets, refusing to let her touch me. I told her I was only there for my toolbox and my personal journals. My father intercepted us before my mother could launch into a full guilt trip about family unity. He pointed toward the Miller Group panels and asked me if I could at least tell the crew how to fix the orientation. I walked over to the mahogany and ran my fingers over the rough, poorly sanded surface of the wood. It was ruined beyond repair because they had cut the pieces against the grain to save on material costs. I told him that the only way to fix it was to scrap the entire batch and start over with new lumber. Lily scoffed and said that was a waste of money and that we could just use a darker stain to hide the mistakes. I looked at her and realized she truly believed that craftsmanship was just a series of clever cover-ups. I explained that a client like Miller Group pays for the natural beauty of the wood, not a paint job. My father's face went pale when I told him the cost of the replacement materials and the labor hours involved. He asked me how I could be so cold to my own blood when the business was at risk. I told him that blood doesn't pay for 60-hour weeks or engineering degrees that are ignored. The atmosphere in the shop shifted from desperation to a sharp, brittle anger as I began to pack my tools. My mother started shouting that they had paid for my college, and that I owed them my life's work as interest. I didn't remind her that I had worked every weekend and summer for 10 years to cover the costs they claimed to have handled. I didn't mention that Lily's college had been a series of expensive parties that they had fully funded without question. I just wrapped my Japanese hand saws in their protective cloths and placed them into my rolling chest. One of the floor workers, a man named Mike, who had taught me how to sharpen a blade when I was 12, watched me. He didn't try to stop me because he knew exactly what was happening and why I had to leave. He gave me a small, solemn nod and went back to his workstation to pretend he wasn't listening. Hey. My father stood in the center of the floor, looking at the machines he no longer knew how to operate. He had spent so long as a legacy manager that he had forgotten the actual mechanics of his own trade. He looked like a king who had just discovered his crown was made of plastic. Lily tried one last tactic by standing in front of the shop door and demanding that I hand over my digital keys. She said that if I wasn't part of the team, I shouldn't have access to their proprietary designs and client data. I handed her the thumb drive I had prepared, which contained nothing but the public domain safety manuals and blank templates. She took it with a look of triumph, thinking she had somehow outsmarted me in the final moment of our conflict. My mother stood behind her, nodding in approval as if this small act of petty theft was a major victory. They were so focused on the digital scraps that they didn't realize the actual value was walking out the door. My brain was leaving the building, and all they were left with were the empty shells of my previous work. I pushed my tool chest past them and felt the heavy wheels crunch over the stray wood chips on the floor. The sun was blinding as I stepped out into the yard and began loading my gear into the truck. My father didn't follow me outside, but I could see him through the open bay doors. He was touching the ruined mahogany with a look of profound, terminal regret. I sat in my truck for 5 minutes after the gate closed behind me and just focused on the rhythm of my own breathing. My phone buzzed one last time with a message from the Miller Group's owner, asking if I had a moment to talk. I called him back immediately, and we spoke for 20 minutes, while the thunderstorm finally broke over the city. He didn't want the Hartman family brand anymore. He wanted the person who had actually designed his furniture. He told me he was pulling the contract, and that his legal team would be handling the exit clauses. He asked me if I could be ready to take over the project as an independent consultant within the next month. I told him I would need to secure a space and hire a small, dedicated crew of professionals. He laughed and said he already knew 3 other developers who would follow him to my new shop. I hung up and watched the rain wash the dust off my windshield, feeling the weight of the world lift. The fear of the unknown was nothing compared to the crushing weight of being undervalued by my own parents. I started the engine and drove away from the warehouses and the smell of asphalt. I decided to move forward with my own plans. A week after I stopped my unpaid labor, I stood near my new rented space, watching a driver stack a crate for the Miller contract. My hands didn't shake anymore, though the scars across my knuckles remained as jagged reminders of the old shop. My objective was simple: finish this shipment and sever the final link to my father's dying legacy. I checked the manifest one last time. Everything looked perfect. A black sedan pulled into my lot, kicking up a cloud of gray grit. My mother stepped out, shielding her eyes from the glare with a designer handbag. She looked out of place against the raw steel and concrete of my workspace. "Laura, we need to talk about the bank's latest notice," she said, her voice tight with a forced, fragile cheer. I didn't stop my work. I kept counting the pallets. The silence between us stretched until the crickets fell quiet. "I have nothing left to give the family business," I told her, clicking my pen shut. She winced at the coldness in my tone. My mother stepped closer, her perfume clashing with the scent of fresh sawdust and motor oil. She looked at the crates bearing the Miller Group logo. Her eyes widened as she realized the scale of my independent operation. "You took their trust with you," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation of deep betrayal. I leaned against the cold metal siding of the warehouse. "I didn't take it. I earned it over 1,000 unpaid nights," I replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled legal document. It was a summons for a mediation hearing regarding the ownership of my proprietary designs. My father was suing me for the very intellectual property he once claimed I didn't possess. The betrayal stung, but it didn't surprise me. They were truly desperate for survival. The forklift groaned as it tilted a heavy load of mahogany. I watched the driver navigate the narrow turn with a grace my sister never bothered to learn. My mother watched him too, her face pale and drawn. "Your father is broken, Laura. He stays in the dark office all day," she said. I wondered if he was mourning the business or just the free labor. The power balance shifted as I handed her a thick, yellow envelope. "These are the logs of every hour I worked without pay," I said. "If he wants to go to court, we can start with back wages." Her hand trembled as she took the heavy packet. She realized then that I had been documenting their exploitation for years. I wasn't the submissive daughter they remembered. I was a professional with a paper trail and a sharp memory. She looked toward the sedan. Her exit was the only move she had left. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a priority alert from the Miller Group's head architect. I stepped away from my mother to take the call. His voice was frantic, but not about my shipment. "The old shop is on fire, Laura. The whole block is going up," he shouted over the wind. I turned toward the horizon. A thin plume of black smoke was rising over the distant tree line. My mother gasped as she saw the dark, swirling column. We stood together in the heat, watching the smoke thicken against the blue sky. My mother dropped her handbag into the dirt, forgetting her pride for a moment. Lily was supposed to be there for the inventory count. She sobbed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The old shop contained all the dry lumber and chemical finishes needed for a massive inferno. If she was inside, there was no way out through the narrow back exits. I grabbed my keys and headed for my truck without a word of comfort. My mother scrambled into the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the growing black cloud. The drive was a blur of red lights and screeching tires. As we rounded the final corner, the heat hit the windshield like a physical blow. The roof of the family workshop had already collapsed into a sea of orange flames. My father stood alone by the gate, screaming. The heat from the inferno peeled the paint off my truck's hood as I skidded to a halt. My father was a silhouette against a wall of orange, his hands clawing at the air. The workshop was a furnace of seasoned oak and volatile lacquers. "She went back for the hard drives," he wailed, his voice cracking like dry kindling. I looked at the loading bay where the fire breathed with a rhythmic, terrifying roar. Lily was somewhere inside that blinding, chemical haze. I grabbed a heavy fire blanket from the truck bed and soaked it with my water gallon. My mother tried to pull my arm, but I shook her off with a single, violent motion. The objective was binary: get Lily out or watch the family legacy turn to ash. I draped the wet wool over my head and shoulders, feeling the sudden, cold weight. The oxygen near the ground was thin and tasted of burnt copper. I dropped to my knees and crawled into the smoke. The interior was a nightmare of falling embers and screaming metal. I navigated by memory, feeling the familiar grit of the concrete floor beneath my palms. The air was thick with the stench of vaporized wood finish and melting plastic. I reached the office door, but the frame had warped under the intense pressure. I kicked the wood until the hinges splintered into the darkroom. Lily was slumped over the desk, clutching a small silver drive like a holy relic. She was unconscious, her face smeared with soot and her breathing shallow. I hauled her onto my back, the wet blanket shielding us both from the overhead flames. The power balance shifted as a support beam groaned and collapsed behind us, blocking the main exit. We were trapped in the very structure that had once been my prison. I turned toward the small ventilation window I had repaired 3 years ago. It was the only opening left in the suffocating black heat. I used a heavy brass paperweight to smash the glass into 1,000 shimmering shards. The fresh air rushed in, feeding the fire, but giving me a moment of clarity. I pushed Lily through the narrow opening first, feeling her weight slide into the dirt outside. I scrambled after her just as the roof joists began to surrender to the gravity of the fire. We tumbled onto the scorched grass, gasping for air that didn't burn our tired lungs. My father didn't run to Lily first. He ran to the silver drive that had fallen from her limp hand. He cradled the metal casing as if it were a wounded child, checking for heat damage. My mother hovered over my sister, her cries lost in the roar of the collapsing building. I sat in the dirt and watched the workshop vanish into a pillar of sparks. Everything they owned was inside that fire, except for the data I had already replaced. The fire crews arrived too late to save anything but the scorched perimeter. I watched the water cannons hit the embers, creating a wall of white steam. My father approached me, clutching the drive with a desperate, shaky grip. "We can rebuild now, Laura. Everything is on here," he whispered, his eyes wide and bloodshot. I looked at the drive and felt a cold, sharp realization. It wasn't the business backup she had died trying to save in the heat. "That drive is encrypted with my personal key, Dad," I said, standing up slowly. He stared at the metal in his hand, as if it had turned into a snake. Lily stirred in the grass, coughing up gray fluid and reaching for my hand. She looked at our father with a hollow, haunted expression. The drive didn't contain the Miller Group specs or the financial ledgers. It contained the original, unedited footage of the accident that had nearly killed Mike years ago. The secret was out in the open, framed by the dying light of the fire. My father had suppressed the evidence to avoid a massive insurance hike and legal ruin. Lily had kept the drive as leverage against him, not as a tool for the business. I looked at my family and saw nothing but a collection of ghosts and lies. The police sergeant walked toward us, his notebook open and his face grim. He wasn't looking for a statement about the fire's accidental origin. The sergeant stopped beside the smoldering ruins, his heavy boots crunching on glass. He didn't ask about the fire or Lily's health. He looked directly at the silver drive in my father's trembling hand. "We received an anonymous tip about suppressed evidence regarding the accident involving Mike," he said. My father's face drained of all remaining color. Objective was now survival in a legal sense, but for me, it was total transparency. I watched the realization sink into my mother's terrified, wide eyes. Pressure mounted as a second officer moved toward my father to confiscate the silver drive. My father pulled back, his knuckles white as he gripped the encrypted metal. "This is private family property, officer," he stammered, his voice thin and high. The smoke from the ruins swirled around us, tasting of bitter ash and old lies. I stepped forward, knowing the encryption key was the only thing that mattered now. I could unlock the truth, or let him bury it in a cell. The power balance shifted when Lily finally sat up and looked at the police. "I was the one who sent the tip," she rasped through her burnt throat. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of pure shock. Lily hadn't saved the drive for the business. She had saved it to finally break free. She was tired of being the polished facade for our father's mounting crimes. The drive held the footage of the faulty safety sensors he ignored. I looked at my sister and saw a stranger who had finally found her voice. She wasn't the spoiled heir anymore. She was a witness to a decade of systemic greed. My father turned his gaze toward me, pleading with his eyes for a final silence. He wanted me to use my brain to fix this one last crisis. I felt the weight of my engineering degree in my mind. It was meant for building things, not hiding the rod in the foundation. Give them the drive, Dad, I said, my voice steady against the roar of the engines. He looked at the sergeant, then back at the glowing embers of his workshop. He realized that the physical fire was nothing compared to the legal one coming next. He handed over the silver casing with a slow, defeated motion. The sergeant sealed it in a plastic evidence bag and nodded to his partner. The secret was no longer a family burden. It was a state file. A news van pulled up to the perimeter, their bright lights cutting through the thick haze. The media was hungry for a story about a local legacy crumbling in a single night. My mother started to fix her hair by instinct, then stopped when she saw the handcuffs. They weren't for my father, but for the foreman who had helped him falsify the reports. He was standing by the ambulance, looking at the ground in shame. A new complication was unfolding before us. The foreman pointed a shaky finger at my mother as the officer led him away. She was the one who signed the insurance affidavits. He shouted over the noise. I turned to see my mother shrink back against the truck, her composure shattering. She wasn't just a passive witness to the bias. She was a partner in the fraud. The brain they claimed I lacked had been used to track their paper trail for months. I knew exactly which documents were forged. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone to show the sergeant. I had copies of the original. Unedited safety logs stored in my cloud. My parents hadn't just given the business to Lily, they had given her a sinking ship. They wanted me out, so I wouldn't see the water rising in the hold. The sergeant took my phone and scrolled through the time-stamped entries. He looked at me with a new sense of professional respect. The fire was out, but the cold reality was just beginning to settle on us. Lily was being loaded into the ambulance, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the shop stood. My parents were separated by officers, their voices silenced by the gravity of the evidence. I stood alone in the dark, the smell of smoke clinging to my skin like a second layer. The biggest client wasn't the only thing they had lost. They had lost the daughter who saved them. The sirens faded into a rhythmic pulse as the ambulance doors clicked shut with Lily inside. My objective was clear. I had to secure the physical evidence, remaining in the charred debris before the site was sealed. The heat still radiated from the black ribs of the warehouse, making the air shimmer and dance. Every step I took toward the ruins felt like a trespass into a graveyard of my own youth. I saw the safe in the corner of what used to be the office. Pressure mounted as a private security detail, hired by the insurance firm, arrived at the perimeter. They began stringing yellow tape with a mechanical, cold efficiency that signaled the end of my access. I had to reach the floor safe before they pushed me behind the line of onlookers and cameras. My boots melted slightly on the hot asphalt, but I didn't stop my steady, determined advance. I saw my father watching me from the back of a squad car, his face a hollow mask. I reached the safe and felt the blistering heat through my heavy leatherwork gloves. The combination dial was warped. But the internal locking mechanism was a high-grade mechanical beast I knew well. I used a pry bar I had snatched from my truck to gain a slim, desperate leverage. The metal groaned, a sound like a dying animal, as I forced the heavy door to reveal its contents. Inside sat a single ledger and a thick stack of cash bound by blue rubber bands. The power balance shifted as the insurance investigator stepped over the tape and stood directly behind me. "That belongs to the estate now, Miss Hartman," he said, his voice as sharp as a razor. I didn't look up, my fingers brushing a small, hidden compartment at the very back of the steel box. I pulled out a series of dated envelopes addressed to me in my grandfather's neat, sloping handwriting. They were postmarked from 5 years ago, but had never been opened or even mentioned. I stood up and faced the investigator, clutching the envelopes to my chest like a shield. These weren't business assets, they were personal gifts that my parents had intercepted and hidden from me. The realization hit me harder than the smoke ever could. They hadn't just stolen my labor, they had stolen my inheritance to fund their failing vanity. I looked at the envelopes and saw the truth of my family's deep, calculated betrayal. My grandfather had intended for me to lead the shop. My father began to shout from the car, his voice muffled by the thick glass of the window. He looked terrified as he realized what I held in my suit: covered hands. My mother sat motionless on the curb, her head down and her expensive silk scarf ruined by ash. The investigator reached for the envelopes. But I stepped back into the shadow of the cooling ruins. I wasn't a child anymore, and I was done playing by their twisted, invisible rules. The investigator paused, sensing a shift in the legal gravity of the situation. If those are personal, they need to be logged, he insisted, though his tone was noticeably less aggressive. I handed him the stack of cash and the ledger, keeping the letters tucked firmly away. I saw the foreman watching us from across the lot, a strange, knowing smile on his face. He knew what was in those letters because he had been the one to hide them. The foreman walked over, ignoring the officer's command to stay back near the ambulance. "He wanted you to have the land, Laura," he said, nodding toward the smoldering remains of the shop. My heart stopped as the words sank into the quiet, heavy air between us. The workshop wasn't just a building my father owned. The dirt beneath it belonged to me. My parents had been operating on my property without a lease for over half a decade now. I looked down at the ground and felt a new power surge through my veins. I realized the land itself belonged to me. Pressure mounted as my father's attorney arrived at the scene, looking slick in an expensive wool coat. He stepped over the charred debris and tried to take the envelopes from my hand. I pulled back, my muscles tensing with a sudden, sharp anger that surprised me. He claimed that any documents found on the site were subject to a family trust agreement. I knew the trust was a lie fabricated to keep me under their control. The attorney's eyes were cold and predatory as he reached for my shoulder. I moved out of his reach and signaled for the sergeant to intervene. The officer stepped between us, his presence a wall of blue authority in the gray smoke. I showed the sergeant the postmarks and the original deed signature from 10 years ago. The attorney tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the hiss of cooling embers. The power balance shifted as the sergeant, the lawyer, to stand back or face arrest. I felt the first real spark of hope in a decade. A new detail emerged as I read the third letter from my grandfather's final days. He hadn't just left me the land. He had left me a secret storage locker. The key was taped to the back of a faded photograph of us in the shop. My father saw the key, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He knew what was in that locker, and he had been searching for it since the funeral. The air around us grew thick with the smell of wet ash. "That locker contains business equipment you have no right to touch," my father shouted from the car. I ignored his yelling and focused on the brass key, glinting in the pale sunlight. My grandfather was a master of contingency plans and hidden assets for his favorite student. He knew my parents were prone to greed and had built a safety net for my future. I realized then that I was never truly alone in this fight. The foreman winked at me from the shadows of the loading bay. I drove toward the storage facility on the outskirts of the city, my heart racing. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, washing the suit from my tired hands. I found Unit 42 and inserted the brass key into the heavy, rusted padlock. It turned with a satisfying click that echoed in the quiet hallway of metal doors. I pulled the shutter up and stared into the darkness of the past. The unit was packed with high-end, vintage woodworking tools of immense value. These weren't just tools. They were the original prototypes for our most famous furniture line. My grandfather had hidden the masters so my father couldn't sell the designs to a cheap competitor. The power shifted entirely into my hands as I realized I held the intellectual property. Without these physical masters, the family business was nothing more than a hollow brand name. I touched the cold cast iron of the precision saw and felt a surge of strength. I was finally the architect of my destiny. I heard the sound of a second car pulling into the gravel lot outside. The attorney had followed me. And he wasn't alone this time. My mother stepped out of the vehicle, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She didn't look like a business owner anymore. She looked like a desperate gambler. She begged me to hand over the prototypes so they could settle their mounting debts. I looked at her and saw the years of manipulation and lies. I said nothing and closed the shutter. "You can't do this to your own mother, Laura," she cried out through the rain. I locked the unit and pocketed the key, my face a mask of hard, cold resolve. She had stood by while my father planned my exit and erased my name. Her loyalty was a one-way street that had finally reached a dead end today. I told her the prototypes would stay in the dark until the legal dust settled. She fell to her knees in the wet gravel, defeated and utterly broken. The attorney tried to move toward the shutter, but I held up my phone. I had already called the police to report a stalking incident and a theft attempt. The blue lights appeared at the entrance of the facility within minutes of my call. The lawyer backed away, realizing that his professional reputation was now on the line. He whispered something to my mother and ushered her back into the expensive sedan. They drove away, leaving me alone in the cold, gray afternoon light. I sat in my truck and let the silence of the storage unit wash over me. I had the land, the tools, and the original designs that started it all. The family business was dead, but something new and honest was starting to grow. I looked at the photograph of my grandfather and felt a deep, quiet peace. The 60-hour weeks were over, and the era of my independence had finally begun. I started the engine and felt the vibration of the road through the wheel. I received a text from the Miller Group architect as I pulled back onto the highway. He had heard about the fire and the deed, and he wanted to talk. He wasn't interested in the insurance settlement or the old shop's messy legal drama. He wanted to know if I could use the original prototypes to rebuild his order. The contract was still mine if I could find a space to work. I smiled for the first time in weeks and gripped the steering wheel tight. The complication arose when I reached my small apartment and saw the front door open. My sister Lily was sitting on the steps, her arm in a white sling. She held a manila envelope that looked identical to the ones I found in the safe. She looked at me with a strange expression that I couldn't quite read yet. "There was a second deed, Laura," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I felt the ground shift beneath my tired feet once again. Rain dripped from her white sling, staining the manila paper a dark, bruised purple. My primary objective was to secure my claim before the family could use a legal technicality to strip it away. I led her inside, the apartment smelling of damp wool and old coffee. The air felt thin as she placed the document on my scoured kitchen table. I could see the official county seal pressed into the corner. My heart hammered against my ribs. Pressure mounted as Lily explained how she found the second deed, hidden in the back of Mom's jewelry box. She had snatched it before the fire consumed the house. Realizing our parents were hiding a final, desperate move. They were going to use this to prove the land was actually held in a joint partnership. She whispered. If she was right, my grandfather's sole gift to me was a legal fiction designed to fail. I felt the walls of my small kitchen closing in. My fingers trembled as I reached for the paper. I pulled the document out and scanned the dense, archaic legal language with a practiced eye. The power balance shifted when I noticed a tiny, handwritten codicil on the back of the final page. It wasn't a partnership agreement at all. My grandfather had inserted a slayer rule clause, typically used in inheritance crimes, but applied here to business ethics. If the current operators committed fraud, the land reverted entirely to the primary heir. My parents had inadvertently triggered their own eviction by falsifying the Mike Miller accident reports. I finally held the kill switch. "They don't know I have this," Lily said, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands. She looked smaller in the dim light of the kitchen. Stripped of her curated, digital perfection, I realized she wasn't here to extort me or plead for our parents. She was handing me the weapon because she knew I was the only one who could swing it. The subtext was clear. She wanted a way out of the wreckage, too. I looked at the signature and felt a strange, cold peace. The truth was finally sitting on the table. We sat in silence for a long moment while the storm rattled the window panes. My objective shifted from defense to a total surgical strike against the people who had erased my value. I needed to get this document to my own attorney before the sun came up. I grabbed my keys and motioned for Lily to stay on the couch. She nodded, her face pale and exhausted from the trauma of the fire. I stepped back out into the rain, the manila envelope tucked tightly under my waterproof jacket. The street was empty. The drive to the lawyer's office was a blur of neon lights reflected in the deep puddles. I felt a new sense of predatory focus as I navigated the slick, midnight streets of the city. My parents had spent years treating me like a tool, but they forgot that tools can be used to dismantle. I was no longer the daughter who stayed late to fix their mistakes. I was the landlord who was about to collect a massive, overdue debt. I parked the truck and ran toward the glass lobby. The night felt electric. My attorney met me in the lobby, his tie loosened and his eyes sharp with curiosity. We spent 3 hours in the conference room, mapping out the legal geometry of the slayer rule clause. He confirmed that the fraudulent insurance claims and suppressed accident footage were the exact triggers my grandfather had envisioned. The land was mine. The insurance payout was mine. And the business name was legally forfeit. The power I held was absolute and terrifying. I watched him file the emergency injunction with a sense of grim, clinical satisfaction. The trap was set. The turn came when he pulled up the latest police report on his dual monitors. My father hadn't just suppressed the footage. He had attempted to frame Mike for the equipment failure. He had planted evidence in the old shop before the fire started, hoping to shift the liability entirely. I felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage that eclipsed any previous resentment. They weren't just greedy. They were willing to destroy an innocent man's life to save their image. I told my lawyer to include this in the filing. The war was officially total. I left the office as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The city felt different now, as if I were seeing the secret structures behind the facades for the first time. I drove back to the apartment to check on Lily, but her car was gone from the curb. I found a small note on the kitchen table written in her hurried, slanted hand. "They came for me, Laura. I couldn't say no." A cold chill settled in the pit of my stomach. They were using her as a final pawn. I called Lily's phone, but it went straight to a dead, hollow voicemail. The pressure escalated as a text message appeared from my father's burner account. He wanted a meeting at the site of the burned shop in 1 hour. If I didn't show up with the second deed, he threatened to report Lily as the one who started the fire. He was willing to burn his own favorite child, to stay out of a prison cell. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. The game was becoming lethal. I arrived at the ruins of the workshop just as the sun broke through the heavy clouds. The black ribs of the building looked like a skeleton rising from the wet, gray earth. My father stood near the loading bay, holding a lighter and a tattered ledger from the safe. Lily was sitting in the back of his car, her face pressed against the glass like a ghost. He didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a cornered animal ready to bite. I stepped out of my truck. "Give me the deed, Laura, or she goes down for the whole thing," he screamed over the wind. I didn't move, my hands empty and visible, as I walked toward him on the scorched ground. I told him the injunction had already been filed, and the police were 10 minutes away. His eyes went wide, and he looked down at the lighter in his hand, as if he'd forgotten it was there. He realized the fire couldn't save him this time. The twist was the sound of a second car approaching from the side. It was Mike, the foreman, and he wasn't alone. He had the original safety inspector from the Miller Group with him. They had been working together to document the faulty sensors, long before the fire even started. My father dropped the lighter into the mud, his final leverage vanishing in the cool morning air. Lily stepped out of the car, her face set in a mask of cold, hard defiance. She hadn't been kidnapped, she had been the bait to bring him into the open. The trap was finally shut. The sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy morning fog. My objective was to hand over the final evidence before my father could destroy it. The inspector held a digital tablet showing a red map of the failed sensors. My father scrambled backward, his boots slipping in the oily muck. He reached for the tattered ledger, but Mike stepped on it with a heavy thud. The pressure of the law was closing in on the ruins. I felt a cold, sharp relief. My mother emerged from the shadows of the loading bay, her eyes darting between the police and the fire. She didn't look at Lily or me. She looked at the silver drive the sergeant was now bagging as official evidence. "We can explain the insurance logs," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of desperation. I realized she had a second set of keys hidden in her palm. She wasn't surrendering yet. She was looking for an escape route through the back fence. The power balance shifted when Mike pulled a small recording device from his pocket. He had captured the conversation from the night before the fire started. My father's voice boomed through the speakers, clearly discussing the plan to dispose of the liabilities. The inspector froze, his face hardening as the confession filled the quiet air. My mother dropped her keys into the mud. The game was truly over for both of them. I felt the weight of the past finally lift. The sergeant signaled for his partner to begin the formal arrests. My father was led toward the squad car, his head hanging in total defeat. My mother followed, her expensive coat stained with ash and failure. Lily stood by my side, her breathing heavy but steady as she watched them go. I handed the manila envelope to the inspector, ensuring the land deed was filed. The physical shop was gone, but the ground was officially mine. I looked at the black skeleton. A new detail emerged as the inspector scrolled through his tablet. He pointed to a structural flaw in the original foundation that I had missed during the chaos. The fire hadn't been an accident or a simple arson for insurance money. The building was already failing because of a deep sinkhole beneath the primary assembly floor. My father had known about the subsidence for months. He had been trying to get out before the ground swallowed the shop. The fire was his desperate exit. I looked at the charred earth and felt a shiver of genuine terror. We had been working over a void for years without ever knowing the danger. My father's greed wasn't just financial. It was a reckless disregard for our actual lives. He had let me work 60-hour weeks on a floor that could have collapsed at any second. I turned toward the squad car, but it was already pulling away. The betrayal went deeper than money. It was a matter of survival. Lily touched my shoulder, her hand trembling against the waterproof fabric of my jacket. He knew, Laura. He told me the floor was vibrating, she said. I realized then that she had been terrified for months, trapped in a role she couldn't handle. She hadn't been the golden child, she had been the shield he used to hide the cracks. We were both victims of a man who valued a brand over his own daughters. I hugged her tight. The rain started again. The inspector cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence between us. He had found a second insurance policy in the digital records that listed me as the sole beneficiary. It was an old clause my grandfather had insisted on before he passed away. I wasn't just the landlord, I was the only person getting paid for the loss. My father had spent years trying to cancel it, but the law had held firm. The micro twist was a phone call from the bank, confirming that my grandfather's trust was finally accessible.